There is a plant in your home, right now, that should not exist outside of one mountain range in southern China. It has no patent, no registered grower, no commercial origin story that any nursery can point to. No single company can show you a receipt for where it began. And yet it sits on windowsills in Oslo, in Toronto, in Auckland, in Sao Paulo, passed hand to hand, cutting to cutting, for 70 years, without ever once being sold by the institution that first carried it out of its homeland. This is not a marketing story. Marketing requires an owner. It requires a source that can be licensed, a supply chain that can be controlled, a name that can be trademarked. This plant has none of that, and so, by every rule modern commerce uses to track a living thing, it should have vanished. Unregistered species do not survive 70 years of global distribution, except this one did, not despite having no owner, but because of it. This is the story of a plant that refused to be owned, and in refusing, it survived a closure that erased almost everything else that came out of its homeland during the same decades. Before we go further, this channel exists to hold the things that got left behind, not to grow an audience, not to chase a number, to keep a record, before the record disappears entirely, the way so many quiet histories already have. If that matters to you, stay only long enough to help us preserve it. That is the only kind of subscription we ask for, not attention, custody. Before you continue watching, please check the link I provided in this video's description. That way, you can verify it yourself. Now, the archive. In 1946, in the cold foothills of Yunnan province, in the high country where the air thins and the mist settles low against the terraces, a Norwegian missionary named Agnar Espegren was preparing to leave China. He had spent years living among mountain communities whose daily knowledge of the local flora ran deeper than any field guide could capture. Among the plants growing wild along shaded slopes and stone walls, one kept catching his attention, a small, round-leafed thing, low to the ground, its coin-shaped leaves held out flat on long individual stems like something reaching toward the light rather than growing into it. Local households already knew this plant. They did not study it. They kept it, in clay pots by doorways, divided and re-divided between neighbors, passed along the way you pass along a recipe, or a name for a child. It had no formal identity in Western botany. It did not need one. It already had a place in the household economy of that region, one that required no naming to function. Espegren took a cutting, not a seed, not a preserved specimen bound for herbarium drawer, a living piece, small enough, light enough, to travel folded inside a coat pocket on the long journey back to Norway, where nothing resembling it existed in any collection, public or private. He could not have known, standing at that departure, that he was carrying the last version of this plant that would leave China for the next 4 decades. Within a few years, the political ground shifted beneath the entire country, borders sealed, exports, plant and otherwise, stopped almost entirely. What had been an open route between two worlds closed, and closed hard, for a generation. The plant did not know this either. It simply kept doing the only thing it knew how to do. Biologically, this is where the story stops being about luck and starts being about design. Pelea peperomioides propagates almost entirely through basal offshoots, small, fully formed plantlets that rise directly from the base of the mother plant, or from its shallow root system, without requiring pollination, without requiring seed dispersal, without requiring a single trained hand. A gardener does not grow this plant so much as divide it. A single specimen kept on a windowsill in Bergen or Trondheim could produce a dozen genetically identical offspring within a year, and each of those, given a pot and a little light, could do the same again the following year. This is not an ornamental convenience. It is an evolutionary strategy, one shaped by a plant whose ancestors likely spread across shaded, disturbed mountain ground by exactly this method, vegetative reproduction, favoring speed and redundancy over the slower, riskier path of seed and pollinator. In its native range, this let it colonize unstable slopes quickly. In a Norwegian sitting room, thousands of kilometers from anywhere it had evolved to grow, the same mechanism let it colonize something else entirely. A continent's worth of homes, without a single seed ever crossing a border. Its physical architecture reinforced the effect. Round leaves, held individually on radiating stems, angled to catch maximum light in the dim understory conditions it once depended on in the wild, a shape so distinct, so immediately recognizable, that ordinary people gave it names long before science did. Coin plant, pancake plant, UFO plant, missionary plant, names assigned not by taxonomists, but by the households that kept it alive. one gifted cutting at a time, for reasons that had nothing to do with classification and everything to do with recognition. For 38 years, it had no scientific name at all. It moved through Scandinavia first, then crossed into Britain, then spread into wider continental Europe, not through any commercial channel, not through a single import license, but through informal human networks that left almost no institutional trace. Church congregations exchanged cuttings after services. Missionary families corresponded by letter and enclosed a small wrapped stem along with the usual news. Neighbors divided pots over garden fences. None of it was documented. None of it needed to be. It was not formally described in scientific literature until 1984, nearly 4 decades after Espegren's coat pocket first carried it out of Yunnan, when botanists finally reconciled what thousands of ordinary households across Europe already knew intimately with what the discipline of taxonomy required before it would grant a plant a name of its own. This delay was not oversight, it was structural. A plant that moves entirely through gift economies, rather than commercial supply chains, produces no invoice, no shipping manifest, no import record for an institution to follow. It leaves no trail because there is no ledger built to record generosity. It was, in the language of the very systems meant to track it, unmanageable, inconvenient to catalog, unownable in precisely the way industrial horticulture requires ownership to function, through patents, through licensed propagation rights, through a single traceable point of commercial origin. This plant offered none of those handles, and so it simply moved past the systems built to hold it, for as long as those systems existed without noticing. Modern plant physiology and soil science have since confirmed, almost as an afterthought, what 4 decades of uninstructed kitchen windowsill propagation had already proven without a single published study. Resilience, in this species, does not require intervention. The plant tolerates inconsistent light. It tolerates irregular watering, long gaps between attention, the ordinary neglect of a busy household. It self-corrects, reorienting its leaves toward whatever light source it is given, adjusting without complaint to conditions nothing in its native mountain habitat ever quite matched. It does not need to be managed in order to persist. It only needs to be left, mostly, alone. Its own homeland tells a harder, quieter story. Within parts of Yunnan, wild populations grew increasingly rare as regional land use shifted across the 20th century, agriculture expanding, terrain altered, habitat pressure mounting in ways that had nothing to do with the plant's resilience and everything to do with the land beneath it, even as it multiplied without limit 7,000 kilometers away, propagating endlessly in pots it had never evolved to grow in. The place that gave it life slowly lost track of it. The homeland forgot what the diaspora kept perfectly intact. Strangers who could not pronounce its province of origin, who had never seen the terraces or the mist or the stone walls where it first grew wild, kept it alive by accident. One gifted cutting, one divided pot, one small act of household generosity at a time, repeated across a continent for 2 generations before anyone thought to write it down. Now, in a period defined by supply chains that fracture without warning, by nurseries that patent living organisms the way factories patent machine parts, by a climate turning increasingly hostile toward anything unable to sustain itself without constant intervention, this plant offers a quiet, almost embarrassing correction to the way we have come to think about survival. It was never dependent on any of the systems we now call fragile. It did not need shipping routes to reach new ground. It did not need a market to determine its value. It did not need a single institution to certify its existence before it was allowed to spread. It needed only a hand willing to divide it, and another hand, somewhere else, willing to receive what was offered. The knowledge required to keep this plant alive was never lost. It was simply kept outside the ledger, passed by hand, not by invoice, for exactly as long as it needed to be, until the systems built to track ownership finally caught up to something that had never asked for their permission in the first place. Soil does not require permission to hold a root. Time does not require an owner to keep moving forward. This plant survived a sealed national border, a 40-year absence from scientific literature, and total commercial irrelevance for the better part of half a century, because it never once needed any of those things to be true in order to keep growing. If this record matters to you, preserve it, subscribe, not to grow this channel's numbers, but to keep this file from closing the way so many others already have.